I'm a postdoc here at Monell working with Joel Mainland and Pam Dalton. And today I'm going to just talk about some of the work that we've been doing, two separate projects, but related, that are dealing with what Danny just talked about, which is these distorted senses of smell outside of just reduced loss. So there's lots of different smell impairments. The one that we all kind of know about that has been well studied is this reduction in sense of smell. So you can take this cup of coffee and you can ask the question, how strong is this smell? Well, somebody could answer it as very strong, but let's say a group of people actually mention that it has no smell, barely detectable. Well, we might classify these people as having anosmia or hyposmia, or a reduced sense of smell, either full loss of smell or partial loss. But what about these distorted smells that Danny was talking about? Well, we can ask questions specific to this cup of coffee, such as, what does it smell like? And maybe most people would say it smells like coffee, right? Maybe it smells kind of toasty, kind of nutty. But what if somebody says it smells like trash or smells like vomit? Well, this would be a sign that they're smelling this cup of coffee differently than other people, and they might have a distorted sense of smell, which we would classify as parosmia. We could also ask them, when do they smell this cup of coffee? Let's say there's no cup of coffee around them, but they smell it all the time. Well, this would be more of a phantom smell or an hallucination, and we would classify this as phantosmia. So why are these distorted senses of smell important? Well, as you can see from what Danny talked about, is at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of people actually were just talking about their reduction of smell. People are losing their smell pretty suddenly and gaining it back later or not getting it back. But some of the people that are getting it back, they're getting it back in different ways, such as this New York Times article, but there's several others, which are talking about people are getting their sense of smell back, but it's different than what they remember. So the thing is that these distorted senses of smell, they're not very well understood. And what they're really not understood is how do they differ from these more simple loss of smell. So together with Absent, which is a UK-based charity, and some clinicians, we kind of put together a survey to specifically look at these more qualitative smell impairments. And we call this the Sense of Smell Project. Here, we sent out this specifically designed survey out to a bunch of patient groups, and we collected a very large sample of over 2,000. Then we classified this based off of their answers of what they subjectively feel that they have, which is just a simple loss, so a change in strength. And throughout the presentation, we're going to represent this as this nose. And that's about half of our sample. The other half actually represents these distortions. People who say they only have parosmia, which is this kind of distorted box, and 11% of only people who say phantosmia. And that's kind of this outline cigarette. And that we use cigarette because it's the most common of phantoms that people actually report is a burnt. Or both distortions, which we're going to exclude from the rest of this analysis, and I'll explain why we did later. So the big question that we had was with this project is, are these distortions distinct from simple loss? And we can look at across a measure, several measures, the demographics, medical history, perception, quality of life, and kind of come to an answer of that. So moving directly into the results, what we can see here is we have age and then we have gender. On the age side, what we see is parosmia, the distorted box, actually happens the highest peak of when it happens is in younger age. While phantosmia, we could see happens highest in about middle age, while anosmia hyposmia happens much higher at older age than the other two distorted smells. Now on the right, and you're going to see these kind of boxes, these kind of figures a lot. We can see that this normalized prevalence is basically the difference of one of the distortions compared to a simple loss. So if it's along the 0%, that means there's no difference. If it's above, it means it's more prevalent or it's less prevalent. So we can see here is that Phantosmia, there's no difference in gender compared to anosmia hyposmia, but Parosmia, there does seem to be a gender difference where there is more females reporting parosmia than males compared to anosmia hyposmia. So now we're going to move into the medical history differences. For our sample, we see that viruses are the most common sense of when people lost their smell, followed by trauma and then sinonasal. So within a viral loss of smell, we see that parosmia seems to be much more prevalent than Phantosmia and anosmia hyposmia. Interestingly, with trauma, we see that Phantosmia seems to be the most prevalent. And with sinonasal, so this is like polyps or maybe a deviated septum, we see that that the Phantosmia and anosmia are more prevalent than parosmia. Now, if we look specifically at how they lost their smell, we see that the way they lost it actually changes and the parts of their loss change, where we see that parosmia is much more of a sudden loss than a gradual loss compared to a simple loss. And what we also see is with block frequency. So we see that people with parosmia typically don't have a blocked nose when they lost their sense of smell. Now, interestingly, and this is something that's kind of been hinted at in the literature, is that, and we see it in our sample, that parosmia maybe kind of aligns with recovery. So here we see that the time since the onset of their smell loss is right around 3 to 12 months, which is kind of around the time that most people recover from neuronal damage to the olfactory epithelium. And what we also see is that most of them are reporting that things have improved since the onset of their smell loss. So people are showing that they can smell better, and they are and they might be entering regeneration. And maybe this is a sign of having parosmia. It seems like this is more prevalent around there. And this kind of follows what I was talking about earlier with COVID, where we're now seeing a lot of parosmia during the time when people are getting their smell back. Now, we wanted to look a little bit about, dive a little deeper into the perception of parosmia. So what are the type of distortions that people are having? So here, this is a little comic done by Chrissy Kelly. She runs the Absent UK charity group. And she just wrote this little thing called The Little Shop of Parosmia Horrors. So this is her personal experience and experiences she's heard from patients of what are the types of foods in the shop that would cause a distortion, and usually a negative distortion. So when we actually ask the same question, we ask, what are things that are actually distorted? What we get, and to explain in detail about the distortion, when we put this into a big word cloud, we actually get very similar things that the patients, and Chrissy has mentioned herself, where we get coffee, we get onion, garlic, these are more sulfur compounds, meat and cooked foods. We see that these are kind of have a high chance of being distorted. Now, when we take all these sentences where people describe their distortions, and we run it through what's called sentimental analysis. So here we're looking at a positive or negative sentence. What we see is that what you would expect, most things are very negative. So people describe all these distortions as not enjoyable or impacting their life negatively. But there are some positive ones, which was surprising for us. And when we look into the actual sense of distortions, one quote that I just pulled right out is this one, which is, "My smell distortions are actually fairly pleasant." flatulence smells like extra virgin olive oil, and sometimes I smell bubblegum. So lastly, we wanted to create a metric that would be useful for clinicians to rate the severity of these distortions, and if that actually even matters to the quality of life. So out of the different metrics, we found that duration and frequency. So how long does the distortion last, and how frequent do you experience them? Adding this together gets a pretty good idea of the degree of severity. Here, when we look at this top right graph, what we can see is that parosmia seems to have a much higher severity than phantosmia. Another thing is we see that this moves linearly with the impact to quality of life, such that a higher degree of severity means that somebody is not enjoying, has a higher impact to the quality of life, and is disturbing their life more. So in conclusion to our study, what we see is that parosmia and phantosmia are distinct disorders and shouldn't be lumped together, which has been done so far in the literature. When people talk about these distortions, they say distortions, and they include parosmia and phantosmia, but they're clearly distinct. We see that they're distinct by demographics, medical history, quality of life, and the severity of a disorder could be an important tool for diagnosis. Now, I told you about the both, right? So this is people who have both parosmia and phantosmia. Well, this both category, as you can see, I've outlined it, was a pretty big part of our sample. And if you can see the kind of brown, it doesn't really fit. It doesn't fit in parosmia, it doesn't fit in phantosmia. It's kind of in the middle a lot of the times. So it's kind of a rough estimate of both groups, right? So it doesn't follow a pattern. So the question is, we need to figure out how can we identify people, because a lot of people are saying both, and they might have phantosmia, they might have parosmia, they might actually have both, but we're not seeing a clear pattern. So we need a better way than just subjectively asking somebody if they have parosmia or phantosmia. We need an objective diagnosis, and that's kind of what we're working on. So I'm not going to talk about this test too much because I think there's later talks that go into a little bit more, but we have this test called the Sentinel Rapid Test, and we've been playing around with this to see how well it does for quality disorders. So simply, people smell all three patches. One of these patches have an odorant. They rate the intensity of this odor. They also rate what it is. Let's say they choose B, they're correct, it's coffee, right? So can we take this these existent criteria for smell loss that we were using, ID, identification, and intensity, maybe add something else that we learned from this project? And that's exactly what we did. So we asked in another question. So let's say they had coffee. And we asked them, I want you to now rate the pleasantness of this coffee. And I want you to also rate the pleasantness of imagined vomit. And we take the difference of the score and make a hedonic score. So based off of what we've seen, most people actually rate things as negative, specifically coffee. And most people sometimes have imagined that imagined vomit is actually less unpleasant than most people. So you get what's called a valence flip. And using this along with the other ID, intensity, we can actually do a pretty good job at actually finding out who is parosmia in a smell loss population. Here we see that parosmia versus anosmia, we're getting a pretty high accuracy. And same thing with parosmia versus hyposmia. It's a little bit lower, but we could still do it. So I'd like to thank who worked with me on this smell loss quality survey, which is Joel Mainland, who is my PI here, Chrissy Kelly, who offered us the patient population, but also had a lot of advice on what we should be looking at, Jane Parker, who's doing really great molecular work looking at what are the chemical properties that are actually creating these distortions, and Thomas Hummel, a clinician out of Germany, that always has great advice and helped a lot in this paper. Lastly, I'd like to thank the Sentinel team on that last couple of slides I showed you, which is a big group here at Monell that's doing a bunch of really interesting things with that card.